We're now going to hear from Dr. Julia Long. So Julia Long is a lesbian feminist with a background in research and campaigning and against male violence, who is now focused on building women's community, growing veggies, and living the revolution now.
What I'm going to be talking about is I will talk about this term, this incarnation of feminism called gender critical feminism, but I'm mainly going to be looking at that through a focus on Holly Lawford Smith's book of the same name, Gender Critical Feminism. There's a few reasons for that. Firstly, because I have already done a talk some time ago where I was talking kind of fairly generally about what I think are some of the problems and issues with gender critical feminism. So I didn't just want to repeat that. And also because I think the publication of Holly's book is obviously very significant in that it's going to have quite a far and wide reach. It's published by Oxford University Press, so it's going to be going into all the sort of academic institutions, and I think it's going to be seen as a very authoritative account, and so therefore I think it's definitely worth engaging with her main kind of premise and arguments there. I know that Holly has also spoken about the book on one of the Radical Feminist Perspective sessions, along with Caroline Norma and with Jo. So I think that's really good that she did that. And I very much hope that what I'm going to say here is taken in the spirit of a dialogue and also as a way of building on analysis kind of across the board from a radical feminist perspective, and also maybe building from some of what Holly does in the book. I am going to be making some quite serious critical points about what I think are the problems with kind of broadly the politics of the book, because I do think there are substantial problems with that, but it's very much in the spirit of looking at what those politics are and where we can go with that in terms of a dialogue and sort of going forward. But anyway, before I do any of that, I actually wanted to start by talking a little bit about radical feminism, partly because I suppose one of the main things that Holly does with that book is to assert gender critical feminism as some kind of successor to radical feminism. She certainly speaks about radical feminism in the past tense a lot in the book, and talks about gender critical feminism in language like the latest incarnation of radical feminism, that kind of thing. So I did want to begin with a focus on radical feminism, not least because this particular week has particular significance for me, because it's the 10-year anniversary since the Radical Feminist Conference RadFem 2012, which took place sort of in the middle of July of 2012, and which I was very much involved in organising and participating in. And I think, if I may say so, I think that actually was quite a significant contribution to the development of radical feminist politics in the United Kingdom at the time, and it was part of a much broader resurgence of radical feminism across the board. And I think around about the same time there was another radical feminist conference called, I think it was RadFem Reboot, I think was the one happening in the United States, like within a week or two of each other. And there were other conferences that also went on in the United States and in Australia at the same time. And then there were a number of conferences in the following years in the UK, including RadFem 2013, FemiFest, RabFems Resist, a small conference on radical feminist perspectives on transgenderism in 2014, the much bigger Thinking Differently conference. And actually, again, speaking of anniversaries, it's the 6th anniversary of that conference today. It was Saturday, the 16th of July, 2016. There was an Andrea Dworkin conference in 2015, and there were a number of European women's gatherings, from around about sort of 2016 onwards. So anyway, I'm rattling through all of those just to say that radical feminism, I think, is very much alive, and I think the Women's Declaration International and sort of related projects and initiatives are very much indicative of that. Alongside this, this kind of, I guess, flourishing of all these different conferences and events, there has also been ongoing publications, very, very significantly, obviously, of Sheila Jeffrey's work, Gender Hurts, in 2014, which I think is extremely well, foundational, definitely highly influential in terms of the current, what's become the gender critical movement. Publications of things like Gail Dine's Pornland, and all the publications by Spinifex Press, which I can't sort of list here, but my little iPad is perched on one of them here, the Not Dead Yet, which I think is a very very well chosen title for the book that came out last year from Spinifex, and I think it's particularly relevant in terms of thinking about some of Holly's claims and arguments in her book. But basically to say that radical feminism is obviously an ongoing movement, and I think that's really important. Crucial, in fact, and I think that's one of the things that probably a few of us have taken issue with regarding Holly's book. So I wanted to start off by talking a bit about the politics of the book and what the book does politically, whether it's what Holly necessarily intended to achieve or not. I think this is what it achieves politically, and what I think is, to say the least, problematic. So she very much asserts in the book that she asserts the salience and importance and relevance of this movement that she calls gender critical feminism as basically the way forward for feminism. And I'm going to quote what she says in the preface. So she says, "I wrote this book because I think gender critical feminism presents the greatest challenge to conservative or traditionalist views about gender and has the best chance of overturning it. I think it is more ambitious and significantly more appealing and coherent than the alternative heterodox view of sex/gender. Contemporary feminism," and by this, when she talks about contemporary feminism, what she's saying here is what we would all recognise as the kind of choice feminism, or, well, actually, I think it'd be more accurate just to call it anti-feminism. But anyway, it seems to have managed to use this term feminism quite successfully. But the kind of usual trans women are women, sex workers work, choice feminism. Anyway, she says contemporary feminism is kind, inclusive, and affirming of women's choices, whatever they happen to be. Those traits have value, but they will not overturn thousands of years of oppression on the basis of sex, or earn women their liberation. I hope to persuade you that gender critical feminism is the theory and movement that we need." So that's where she's setting out her stall for what she wants to argue and achieve with the book. But I think what she does there is really, really important to pay attention to, because she's basically saying that you've got these conservative views of gender, conservative or traditionalist views, and then on the other side you've either got the sort of choice feminism, trans women are women type, anti-feminism, I would say, or you've got what she is asserting in terms of gender critical feminism. But obviously what's missing there is radical feminism. And I think the fact that she supplants radical feminism with gender critical feminism is a huge, huge problem. And I'm going to focus, if I don't run out of time, because I've got a lot of material here, I want to focus on a couple of specific points in the book that I think really illustrate how much of a problem that is. So she makes this case of gender critical feminism as being the way forward, so what has happened to radical feminism in her kind of framing? Like, where is it? Well, later on, she does talk about gender critical feminism as I think she says, the revival of radical feminism. But what I think is so problematic about that is that some of the claims that she makes and some of the things that she asserts around gender critical feminism simply are at odds with radical feminism and actually don't in any way reflect a radical feminist analysis. So and I think also she doesn't really make a case or make an argument that gender critical feminism has sort of supersedes radical feminism. She tends to assert it as a given that this is the case and this is where we are, which I think does a huge disservice to radical feminism. She doesn't really, as I say, she doesn't really engage with that and make the argument in the way that she engages with what we could misname as choice feminism, which I would just say is straightforward anti-feminism. She actually gives the sort of respect to that movement by really engaging with the arguments and trying to refute them and say why gender critical feminism is better in a way that I don't think she does, or she certainly doesn't do consistently with radical feminism. So I think what the book actually, the politics of the book, what it achieves politically, I think is very, very serious, and I think very, very damaging actually in terms of the way that she kind of consigns radical feminism to the past. And I was thinking that if I was going to, and I'm not saying she's doing this intentionally at all, but if I was going to set out to undermine a political movement, I think what I wouldn't do is write a book about it that really engages with its ideas and arguing why it's wrong, or that kind of thing, because actually that in some ways might actually just give more impetus to it, or maybe serve to validate it in some way. But I think probably what I would do if I really wanted to undermine a movement, I would perhaps pay homage to some of its early thinkers and scholars, and Holly definitely does that in this book. There's, I think probably one of the strongest, or maybe the strongest part is the early section where she really does engage with some of the early radical feminist thinkers. But I think I would constantly refer to it in the past tense. I think I would kind of assert and assume its demise rather than argue for it. I would assert and assume that it's being replaced by another movement. I would probably use phrases about this other movement to suggest that it's the latest incarnation of the movement that I want to undermine. I would fail to engage with its current actors in terms of groups and individuals. I would probably completely erase some of the very key texts of that movement that are addressing some of the most crucial questions today, such as in this case, I think things like gender hurts. I think she does briefly refer to the transsexual empire. And maybe I would also erase some of the other really fundamental work on language. And I think that I would misrepresent the movement that I want to I would misrepresent the movement that I want to champion as being consistent with the movement that I want to undermine, suggesting that it's a kind of natural successor. And I think in doing that, whether intentional or not, I think that those kind of strategies, which I see her doing in the book, seriously actually undermines radical feminism as a movement, which I think is a really, really serious problem of the book. As I say, even though I have no doubt that Holly was writing with the best of intentions, and there is definitely, some pretty impressive scholarship in the book as well. But overall, I think this what the book does is consign radical feminism to the past and suggest that it's all been replaced by what I don't think at all is a revival of radical feminism. I don't think gender critical feminism is that. And I think it's particularly problematic given that it's been a book that has been produced within sort of, I know Holly works, within an academic context. So it was published by the Oxford University Press. It's going to, reach into the academic libraries, into the syllabuses, etc. And I think it's going to, we know already that within academic settings, radical feminism has in large part already been pretty much eradicated or misrepresented or eliminated, and the key texts don't get onto onto reading lists, etc. So I think that this, as it is at the moment, the publication of this book is a really serious problem, or the politics of that book is a really serious problem. I do think that the work on the early radical feminist thinkers is valuable, but I think the problem is that it's all spoken about as being in the past. And I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the sections where she talks about what gender critical feminism leaves behind in terms of radical feminist ideas. So I'm going to start then by talking a bit about what I think is one of the main problems of the book, certainly from my perspective. I know that Holly was writing in the Australian context. I think she's at the University of Melbourne. I'm very much looking from a English, British, UK context. And one of the things that I found really a problem about the book is that her assertion that gender critical feminism is this kind of natural successor of radical feminism, and it comes out of radical feminism. From what I can see, it just does not map onto the UK situation at all. If we look at some of the main groups and dominant voices in the UK context, groups like obviously Women's Place UK, Fair Play for Women, some of the others, the voices like those who've written books like Helen Joyce, Kathleen Stock, etc. These groups and individuals definitely aren't coming from a radical feminist politics or political background. They're coming, sometimes they're coming from socialist feminist backgrounds. Sometimes they're coming, are still very much involved with socialist feminism. Sometimes I think they're coming from a more kind of classical sort of liberal type background. Some of the groups I would say seem to me to be coming from quite an apolitical background, but are just concerned about maybe have been sort of mobilised because of the threat to women's rights and women's spaces, etc. I do want to mention, I can actually, I've got it on gallery view, so I can see Kelly J there. I do want to mention Standing for Women here, and I'm sure Kelly J will be speaking about her coining of what I think is a rather brilliant term of feminism, which sets one of the many things, I guess, which sets that particular group, Standing for Women, apart from some of the others. But certainly, so I'm not really talking about Standing for Women here. I'm definitely not talking about Women's Declaration or Lesbian Rights Alliance or Get the L Out, which we can see are very much part of a radical feminist tradition. But in terms of some of the main voices now that are associated with this term gender critical feminism, I really don't think that this idea that it's come from radical feminism maps on to the picture at all. Maybe I do think that radical feminism, because some of that early work by radical feminists has certainly, I think, served as a kind of galvanizing factor for some of these groups. You could certainly see the influence of radical feminism there, but certainly they're not coming from a radical feminist tradition, and they don't follow radical feminist kind of principles and analysis. So that's one thing that I think is, I just don't think it works. I don't think it kind of maps on in that way. So again, I've lost the balance of my prop from my talk. So one of the reasons why, several of the reasons why I think Holly's analysis doesn't map onto the UK situation is if we see some of what I think are the kind of key features of this gender critical feminism in the UK, we can see that they're really at odds with radical feminism. They're really at odds with our understanding of women as a sex class or a sex class, and our understanding of patriarchy, our understanding of gender, etc. So I'm just going to briefly go through what I think are the some of the really sort of identifying features of gender critical feminism, and I think it speaks for itself as to why this hasn't come from radical feminism. So first of all, in the UK, most of the groups, like some of the ones I've mentioned, and most of the kind of what I might call mainstream gender critical groups, are not fundamentally opposed to transgenderism. They're not. Most of them kind of were set up in terms of the consultation about the reform of the Gender Recognition Act. And they made a case as to being opposed to what was originally called, I think, self-declaration, and then became called self-ID, self-identification of so-called gender. They didn't seek the repeal of the Gender Recognition Act, and they used words like they're opposed to the extreme gender identity movement. So they're not, and again, this is where Standing for Women is obviously very much sort of at odds again also with these gender critical groups. So obviously, as radical feminists, we are completely opposed. I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, I think it's perfectly obvious, but we understand transgenderism as a manifestation of patriarchal oppression of women. We don't kind of make any caveats or any exceptions for that. It's completely clear. So I think that's one of the really early ways where they parted company with us. We also don't actually believe that transgenderism is a thing. We understand it as a patriarchal ideology, but we don't think there's such a thing as a trans person, a trans child, a trans woman, that there's such a thing as transphobia. So we are not going to qualify anything we say by starting off by saying I'm not transphobic or I support transgender rights, which a lot of the gender critical movement does, and the kind of thing that Holly does also in this book. I'm going to have to, even though I know you've given me lots of time, Joe, I'm going to have to cut some of this out. So I'll just kind of list some of these things, I think, because I think we can maybe talk about them a bit more in the chat, and they've probably been really well rehearsed in this context anyway. So obviously, we radical feminists have no truck with this notion of true trans, which again I think is also a euphemism, because it's actually used as a kind of another Trojan horse to allow men to come and speak as some version of not being men, whether that's as a transsexual or a trans woman without the space between the two words, this kind of thing. So but the gender critical groups and individuals very much, and we can see this in their work, in their events, in their contributions on social media, we can see that they make this exception about men, which actually means that what they do is that they shoehorn men into the arena as supposed allies and spokespeople for our movement. Another thing that some of the gender critical feminist groups what their politics is about a very strong affiliation with the left, and about prioritizing men on the left. And I think they've been so concerned to try and win over their male, I don't know what we call them, male companions or male antagonists, whoever, on the left, is that they prioritize that over their responsibility to not gaslight women. I think that's one of the things that I've seen over and over again. So they will use language that placates men on the left at the expense of not being completely honest and truthful and straightforward with other women. Very briefly, I know I've said a number of times before, I think the term itself, gender critical feminism, is clearly not reflective of a radical feminist politics, because we would not say that we are critical of gender. We would say that we thoroughly reject gender, or that we are gender abolitionists. I don't think any one of us would use the term patriarchy critical. So why would we use the term gender critical? As Leah Keith observed recently, we wouldn't say slavery critical. So I think the fact that term is used by these groups and individuals is in itself illustrative of their distance, political distance from us. And also, as I've observed before, I find that much of what comes under the rubric of gender critical feminism actually isn't even really that critical of gender in terms of the radical feminist analysis of femininity, of heterosexuality, of, this kind of broader issues around gender. That is not really to be found, and it's certainly something I think that gets also erased in Holly's book. So I think for all of these reasons, it doesn't. Her argument that gender critical feminism comes from radical feminism or is a natural successor to it doesn't really work. I haven't got time to go into this particularly, but I did just want to mention, obviously in recent days, weeks, there's been a lot of talk from the gender critical groups about, once again, about this creating a narrative about working with the right, all these dangers about working with the right. I don't remember Holly. I think Holly does talk about this a bit in her book, but I just wanted to address some of the things that have been that I think are sort of going around at the moment in terms of UK gender critical feminism. It seems to me, from what I've seen of some of this stuff, and I haven't necessarily seen all of it, but I think what is being done is that there's this kind of spectre that's being created that is trying to create kind of quite an extended fear of association with, I don't know, probably with certain individuals or certain groups, because of these dangers of working with the right, so to speak, and who these groups are and what they're about, and how dangerous they are for for women, for women's rights. Now, I'm not going to talk about the US context, but I will talk about the UK context, and I've really got all of this endless kind of verbiage about it is really making me ask three questions. For a start, I'm not even going to talk about the rights or wrongs of it, but I'm just going to ask, for a start, all of this verbiage around how terrible it is to work with the right and how dangerous these groups are. I wonder who is actually working with the right in this way that is kind of being set up as given. Like, if these groups are, which I really haven't seen any evidence, I don't even know quite who is being referred to here. Like, if they are, what does this involve, and how is any kind of this kind of an alliance or supposed alliance? What is actually happening, and how is it actually promoting anti-woman interests? Because I think they're very short on saying that, but what they're very strong on doing is kind of whipping up a kind of scaremongering type thing. There's another bit there that I'm just going to have to skip. And also, I wonder, when there is all of this kind of rhetoric going on about not working with the right, I wonder, why is it not okay to work with those who, in some cases, do seek to end women's right to abortion? Why is it not okay to work with those groups, but it is okay to work with those on the left who seek to end women's rights, full stop? Like, why? Like, why is one okay and not the other? I don't understand that. And then finally, why is it okay to be very emphatic in vocally opposing patriarchy patriarchal right-wing agenda when it comes from Christian doctrine and practices, but not when it comes from other religious doctrine and practices. Again, I just think there's a real inconsistency there. And it seems to me that also what goes along with all this rhetoric around this so-called working with the right, what I think kind of gets elided in that are some of the real problems of gender critical feminism in terms of championing so-called transsexuals as being trans women, and some of this kind of stuff. And also what goes along with it is a very thoroughgoing demonization and vilification and personal attacks on individual women, not least some of the company here, as we all know. And I think that isn't just about I don't think that's just about sort of personalities or personal motivations. I think there's a very clear politics behind some of that, and I think it's about a political will to dominate a terrain and to suppress other voices. So anyway, I did just want to say something about that. I do also want to mention some of the achievements of gender critical feminism, because clearly what comes under this broad banner of gender critical feminism, I've talked a bit about things I really don't agree with about it, but undoubtedly there have been some very successful campaigns, and particularly some successful legal cases, which I think would all kind of come under this term of gender critical feminism. And not least, maybe one to pull out from that, is the Maya Forstater ruling that gender critical beliefs, even though obviously recognizing that there are two sexes isn't really a belief of any kind, or it's just a kind of statement of the bleeding obvious, as Basil Fawlty might have said. But I think the ruling that gender critical beliefs are worthy of respect in a democratic society is something that is absolutely invaluable, and it's invaluable to many of us in our workplaces and in other contexts. That is really important. And the fact that there were findings of discrimination against Maya Forstater because she held those beliefs, I think is again hugely important. So I'm really, I don't want to underplay any of these big achievements, and there are sort of plenty of others as well. But I do think there are some really serious issues with the politics of gender critical feminism. Right, Jo, if I take about another 10 minutes, is that okay?
Yes, that's fine, and then we'll get everybody on. We might run over a little bit, and thanks so much, Kelly J, for coming and waiting for this, because we've changed the time, but yeah, that's okay.
Okay, so I wanted to just sort of focus in on a couple of parts of the book which I hope are illustrative of the problems of Holly's claim that gender critical feminism is in some ways a kind of a natural successor or a part of a revival of radical feminism. Because if we look at the section titled something like the idea, radical feminist ideas that gender critical feminism leaves behind, I want to look at what she says there about the ideas around the politics of lesbianism and the politics of separatism. So if we hold in our minds that what she's saying is that basically radical feminism is no more, and we've now got this thing called gender critical feminism, let's have a look at what she says here about lesbianism. She says, gender critical feminism is supportive of lesbianism, but it has no commitments that make it unacceptable or a betrayal for women to have sexual or romantic relationships with men. So she kind of frames it as, in a way, a bit of a kind of choice feminist issue. Gender critical feminism is supportive, but it's not interested in saying that it's kind of unacceptable or a betrayal. I'm not particularly interested in getting into ideas or arguments around unacceptability or betrayal. What I am really interested in is the radical feminist analysis of heterosexuality and the radical feminist analysis of, I don't think she particularly talks about it here, of femininity and gender. but if we just stick to the radical feminist political critique of heterosexuality, obviously there's a huge amount of work that's been done here. Where's the bit? What did she say about political lesbianism? She says something like, all she has to say about political lesbianism is that there is an internal disagreement over the moral status of political lesbianism, with some vehemently rejecting the idea that it is possible for a woman to choose to be a lesbian. That's, as far as I can see, that's all she says about it. And she also talks about the radical feminist analysis of heterosexuality, or sort of, the politics of lesbianism as an alternative, as is problematic because it alienates too many women from feminism. So she basically wipes out the critique of heterosexuality, the importance of that critique, and the crucial insight of radical feminists that there's nothing inevitable about heterosexuality, and any woman can be a lesbian. She just dismisses that. And I think in particular, again, maybe if I'm sure Sheila has some contributions to make to this in the chat, but what we've seen, particularly with the Korean feminists and others, is a huge revival of interest in lesbianism, lesbian feminism, political lesbianism. And so if Holly is saying that gender critical feminism is replacing radical feminism, she's basically totally eliminating one of the most crucial aspects of radical feminism in doing that, which is another reason why it's a big problem. Similarly, I won't go into the section on separatism. I guess it's kind of parallel, but I will go into it, even though I'm pushed for time, because I think it's really, really important. So she says, again, in a sort of similar vein, gender critical feminism is also not separatist. Is also not separatist more generally when it comes to feminist theory of activism. Gender critical feminists will generally work with men and appreciate the support of male allies. And she says that gender critical feminism isn't separatist in what she says in the strong sense, in the way that maybe a lot of us here understand it. But gender critical feminists value female sex separated spaces, which means that separation from men is a commitment, just in a much more limited number of domains. Well, I'm sorry, Holly, but really, what gives you the right to assert that we're suddenly now only concerned with sex separated spaces in limited domains? I absolutely refute that. And there's ongoing work, political movement, ongoing politics of separatism, of political lesbianism, of lesbian feminism. There's plenty of evidence of that, and I think the fact that you just basically cast it aside like that, I actually think what she's saying here is one of the things that is very accurate about gender critical feminism, because that is also what the gender critical groups here do as well. They just champion sex separated spaces for things like refugees, or sports and things like that, but they don't have the wider understanding of and commitment to women only organising, women only living, a commitment to separatism as a really crucial aspect of women's liberation. She just basically does away with that, which is, again, I think a really huge problem with the book. I know I'm pretty much coming up to time. So I'm going to have to cut a load of this out. I thought I had enough. I thought I had just about enough for 40 minutes, but I've probably got enough for about 40 days. I just want to say, in her chapter on transgenderism, I thought a lot of this did actually remind me of Kathleen Stock's book, in that I think because she really seriously misrepresents, or she asserts that gender critical feminism is not anti-trans. She says that. So again, I think that's probably true. Gender critical feminism isn't anti-trans, but in that way, don't try to replace radical feminism with gender critical feminism, because we absolutely are completely opposed to transgenderism, as we are opposed to pornography, prostitution, as we're opposed to any form of men's oppression of women. And so she goes on from there. I mean, I just highlighted so many parts of that section. I just found her arguments there really really kind of pointless, and this sort of endless reasoning about transgenderism and about inclusion of men in women's spaces. It was completely pointless, because I felt that she just fell at the first hurdle, because a women-only space does not have men, full stop. That's non-negotiable. You don't have to make any argument about it. And she says that labeling gender critical feminism as anti-trans is anti-feminist propaganda and the distortion of a movement and theory for women's sex-based rights by labeling it according to what it is not, what it's not about. But we don't say that about anti-pornography, about anti-racism. I think it's I think there's just this real kind of squeamishness about kind of taking the bull by the horns and naming men as men. We see that sort of right the way through, and it's particularly evident, I think, in that chapter. I haven't come on to the manifesto that she gives at the end, and I know that I'm out of time, but maybe that's something that we can return to in the chat, because yeah, I'm sure others will have views on that. Sorry, I skipped a lot, so I hope it was more or less coherent. But from my perspective, the radical feminist analysis of compulsory heterosexuality and compulsory femininity is about looking at what that means in the context of a patriarchal society and the harms of both of those things. That's what it's about. I'm not interested in using those critiques to try to set up some kind of league table in terms of who's a real feminist or who isn't. I'm really not interested in that. I think that's a really kind of pointless exercise. But let's not underestimate the pressures on, and particularly thinking about young women now, the pressures on young women to be heterosexual, whether that's, you know, via the route of femininity, or, you know, that, or the transgenderism kind of forcing them into a different path. But we've got men now saying they're lesbian, so it's like either way, you can't really escape it. And let's think about the analysis of heterosexuality by Andrea Dworkin, and, you know, certainly more recent ones as well. Let's think about the norms that are being established by pornography in terms of what young women are expected to endure through processes of heterosexuality. Let's not underestimate all of those harms and all of that pressure on young women, both in terms of that compulsory heterosexuality, and also in terms of the harms of femininity and that feeling of the unfreedom of your body that compulsory femininity creates. So that's what it's about. It's not about establishing some kind of league table. But what I would say to heterosexual women, or to women who, you know, great fans of femininity, whatever, if you're not interested in that, then at the very least, and I'm not saying Kelly J does this for a moment, but definitely other women have, then if you're not interested in any of that analysis, then at least get out of our way, because we have to speak to other women, and there will be some women for whom that is very, very salient, and it could actually be potentially quite life-saving. So I think that's what I want to say about that. And I also want to say that I totally echo what everyone said about the Standing for Women campaigns, and also include with that the kind of research. We haven't really talked about that, but some of the whole kind, you know, all of the other academic scholarship that has gone on in terms of this particular campaigning, you know, whatever movement. I just also want to say that I think it's not, women's liberation isn't just about campaigns. It's also, this is why I wanted to use this phrase about living the revolution now. I think there's a lot that we can do here and now. It's like Mary Daly talked about the foreground and the background. There's a lot that we can do here and now to enjoy those freedoms that we have and to expand them, just by living the lives that we want to live. And that's what I think is really important. We don't have to ask men. This is where I parted company with Holly's list at the end, which seemed to me a lot about asking men for things, an end to this and more of this and less of that. We can do, not all of this in every situation, but there's a lot that those of us with certain access to certain, economic resources and freedoms, there's a lot that we can do. I enjoy women in only space all the time. I don't have to ask any man's permission for that. I don't have to kind of request it. I don't have to argue to keep, men out of those. We just get on and do it. The same with rejecting femininity, the same with all kinds of things that I think we can do. And so for me, it is very much about just who we are, the lives we want to live. If we want something, I remember it said at the last Mishfest that I attended, if you want something, then create it and then defend it come hell or high water. And there's all kinds of things that we can do within that doesn't necessarily sit under a campaign or scholarship or kind of activism, but just in terms of living the lives that we want to live.